They say the hardest moments are the ones you never see coming. That Christmas, my son screamed at me across the crowded room, the words tearing through me like icy shards. "You're ruining everything." I still feel the sting of his voice echoing, the weight of all the love I poured out met with contempt. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 73 years old. I live in a small apartment in Chicago's Edgewater neighborhood, where the wind off Lake Michigan cuts through your bones and the elevated train rattles the windows every 15 minutes. Every morning for the past 8 years, since Harold died, I've woken before dawn to the smell of damp snow and instant coffee brewing in my tiny kitchen. The floors creak under my worn slippers as I shuffle through rooms filled with memories. Faded photographs on every surface, their colors dulled by time, and tears I've shed in silence. That Christmas morning started like so many others. I'd spent weeks preparing, my arthritis screaming through my knuckles as I wrapped presents I couldn't really afford, my Social Security check stretched thinner than paper. The red tablecloth I spread across my dining table was the same one Harold and I had bought at Marshall Field's 35 years ago, back when we thought we'd have decades of holidays together. Now it was faded and torn at the edges, just like everything else in my life. I remember standing in my kitchen at 5:30 that morning, peeling potatoes for the feast I'd planned. My hands were shaking, not from cold, but from exhaustion. I'd been awake most of the night, my mind churning with worry about whether I'd cooked enough, whether the gifts would be good enough, whether this time, maybe this time, my family would look at me with the love I remembered from years past. The apartment smelled like cinnamon and regret. I'd baked 4 different pies, even though my doctor had warned me about standing too long. My back ached something fierce, but I pushed through it. I always push through it. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We endure. We sacrifice. We give until there's nothing left but the hollow echo of our own breathing. I expected laughter that day. I expected forgiveness for whatever invisible crimes I'd committed in their eyes. I expected a family united around my table, grateful for the woman who'd spent her life putting their needs before her own. Instead, I was met with cold shoulders, whispered criticisms, and finally, his outburst that shattered what remained of my spirit. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got to that moment. Let me tell you about the years of little cuts, the 1,000 tiny wounds that bled me dry. Do you know what it feels like to love someone so completely that you lose yourself in the process? To give and give until you're not sure who you are anymore without their needs defining your existence? I've been the anchor in our family for as long as I can remember. Silent, patient, endlessly giving. When Michael was 25 and fresh out of college with a business degree he'd barely earned, I emptied my savings account to help him move into his first apartment in Chicago's South Loop. $12,000, money Harold and I had saved for retirement trips we'd never take. I told myself it was an investment in his future, swallowing the lump of doubt that rose in my throat every time I looked at my depleted bank statement. "You'll thank me one day," I whispered to myself as I signed the check, my hand trembling not from age, but from the fear that I was making a terrible mistake. After Harold died, when the life insurance money came through, I took care of my grandchildren during their parents' long shifts at work. Emma was 8 then, Tommy was 5, and little Sarah was barely walking. I'd pick them up from school, help with homework, make dinner, give baths, read bedtime stories. My own grief was suffocating me, but I pushed it down, buried it beneath their needs. "Grandma's here," I'd say with a smile that felt like broken glass in my mouth. "Everything's going to be okay." But everything wasn't okay. Every thank you felt hollow, performative. The gratitude slipped through my fingers like sand, leaving behind only expectations. More babysitting, more money, more of myself, until there was nothing left but an empty shell moving through the motions of love. I remember one particularly cold February evening when I'd been watching the kids for 12 hours straight. Michael's wife, Jennifer, came home from her job at the law firm, her designer heels clicking against my worn linoleum floor. She barely looked at me as she gathered her children, her voice sharp with exhaustion and something else. Resentment, maybe. Or entitlement. "Thanks, Mom," she said, but the words were flat, automatic, like thanking a cashier at the grocery store. "How was work?" I asked, desperate for some connection, some acknowledgement that I was more than just free childcare. "Long," she replied, already turning away. "Come on, kids. Time to go home." And just like that, they were gone. No invitation to dinner, no offer to help me clean up the chaos of toys and snack crumbs they'd left behind. I stood in my empty apartment, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight, and wondered when I'd become invisible in my own family. The phone calls became shorter, less frequent. When I'd call to check in, to hear their voices, I could sense the impatience in their responses. "We're busy, Mom." "Can't talk right now. I'll call you back." But they never did call back. And gradually, I stopped calling first. Cold silences greeted my requests for help. When my washing machine broke down and I asked Michael if he could help me figure out how to get it repaired, he sighed heavily into the phone. "Can't you just call a repair guy? I don't have time for this right now." Time. He didn't have time for the woman who'd given him every minute of her life for 32 years. When my arthritis flared up so badly I could barely open a jar of pickles, I mentioned it to Jennifer during one of our brief conversations. "You're probably just overreacting," she said dismissively. "My grandmother was always complaining about aches and pains too." Overreacting. As if decades of hard work, of cleaning houses and waiting tables and raising children, hadn't taken a toll on my body. As if the pain that kept me awake at night was just in my imagination. I started doubting myself then. Was I being too needy, too demanding? Was the love I'd poured out over the years really just manipulation disguised as sacrifice? These questions gnawed at me in the dark hours before dawn, when the pain in my joints was sharpest, and my loneliness felt like a living thing eating me alive from the inside. But it was the discovery I made that changed everything. The moment when doubt crystallized into devastating certainty. Have you ever found something that shattered your entire understanding of your place in the world? Something that made you question every sacrifice, every kindness, every moment of selfless love? It was a Tuesday evening in November, gray and bitter with the promise of winter. I'd gone to Michael's house to drop off some of my famous chocolate chip cookies, a peace offering, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. He wasn't home, but Jennifer let me in with barely concealed irritation. "Just leave them on the counter," she said, already turning back to her laptop. "I have work to finish." As I arranged the cookies on a plate, trying to make them look special, inviting, loved, I knocked over a stack of papers on the counter, financial documents scattered across the granite surface, bank statements, loan applications, investment portfolios. As I gathered them up, apologizing profusely, one document caught my eye. It was a loan application for $50,000. My signature was at the bottom, but I'd never signed any such document. My hands began shaking as I looked more closely. There were other papers, investment accounts opened in my name, credit cards I'd never applied for, even a cryptocurrency wallet showing Bitcoin investments worth thousands of dollars. My son had been using my identity, my credit, my name to fund a lifestyle I couldn't even imagine. The portfolio showed holdings in major tech stocks, Apple, Google, Tesla. There was mention of real estate investments, of a business venture that had apparently failed spectacularly. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moving in and out of accounts I didn't know existed. Money that had been borrowed against my home, against my future, without my knowledge or consent. I sank into their expensive leather chair, my legs suddenly unable to hold me up. The room spun around me, the carefully arranged family photos on their mantel blurring through my tears. How long had this been going on? How much of their comfortable life, the renovated kitchen, the new cars, the private school for the kids, had been built on my stolen identity? That night, I went home and tore my apartment apart looking for any other signs of deception. I found more papers hidden in places I'd forgotten I'd put them. Documents I'd signed without reading carefully, trusting my son completely. Power of attorney forms. Insurance beneficiary changes. Even the deed to my apartment had been modified to include Michael's name. I was no longer the owner of my own life. I sat on my kitchen floor surrounded by evidence of my own gullibility, the linoleum cold against my bones, and cried until I had no tears left. The woman in the family photographs scattered around me, the young mother holding her baby son, the proud grandmother at birthday parties and graduation ceremonies. She was gone. In her place was this hollow shell of a person who'd been so desperate for love that she'd signed away her very existence. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the times Michael had encouraged me to sign papers, just to make things easier. All the times he'd offered to help manage my finances because it's getting complicated, Mom, and you don't understand these modern banking systems. I understood perfectly now. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. When my son called asking for money for Emma's ballet lessons, just $200, Mom, and I know it's a lot, but she's really talented and this could be her future, I said no. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. But it also felt powerful, liberating. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, confusion. What do you mean, no? I mean, no, Michael. I can't help you with money anymore. But, Mom, it's for Emma, your granddaughter. Don't you want to support her dreams? The guilt came flooding back, just as it always did. But this time, I held firm. I'm sure you and Jennifer can figure something out. I hung up before he could argue further, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. It was the first time in my adult life I'd refused to help my child, and it felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The confrontation I was dreading came 2 days later. Michael showed up at my apartment without warning, his face hard with an emotion I'd never seen directed at me before. Not disappointment or frustration. Those I knew well. This was closer to contempt. We need to talk, he said, pushing past me into my living room without being invited. Jennifer was with him, her arms crossed, her expensive coat still buttoned up as if she couldn't wait to leave. Behind them, looking uncomfortable and confused, was my daughter Lisa, who lived in Milwaukee and rarely visited anymore. Sit down, Mom, Michael said, his voice cold and authoritative. We've been talking, and we think you're having some kind of breakdown. A breakdown, because I'd said no to one request for money. I'm fine, I said quietly, but I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. Years of self-doubt don't evaporate overnight. You're not fine, Jennifer interjected. You're being paranoid and irrational. Michael told me about your accusations regarding the financial papers. That's delusional thinking, Mom. Delusional. The word hit me like a physical blow. Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Maybe we should all just calm down and— No, Michael interrupted. This has gone on long enough. Mom, you signed those papers willingly. I have witnesses. You asked me to help you manage your finances because you said you couldn't handle the complexity anymore. The lie was so smooth, so confident, that for a moment I almost believed it myself. Had I asked for help? Had I willingly signed away my independence? But then I remembered the look of surprise on his face when I'd found those papers, the panic in his eyes before he'd composed himself. He was lying, and we both knew it. I never agreed to have you take out loans in my name, I said, my voice stronger now. You're confused, Mom. You're old, and you're lonely, and you're not thinking clearly. Old, lonely, confused. Each word was a knife thrust designed to make me doubt my own perceptions, my own reality. I looked at my daughter, hoping for support, for someone to stand up for me. but Lisa was staring at the floor, unwilling to get involved in what she clearly saw as a family dispute that didn't concern her. The manipulation continued for nearly an hour. They twisted every conversation we'd ever had, reframed every act of generosity as evidence of my mental decline. According to them, I was a burden who'd become too dependent on their kindness. They were the victims of my unreasonable demands and paranoid delusions. By the time they left, I felt completely hollow. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the financial papers I'd found were exactly what Michael said they were. Legal documents I'd signed and simply forgotten about. But that night, as I sat in my kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, something Mrs. Rodriguez from down the hall had said came back to me. She was 85 and sharp as a tack, and she'd lived through enough family drama to recognize the signs. "Mija," she'd told me a few weeks earlier, "when people make you doubt your own eyes, your own memory, your own heart, that's when you know they're the ones who can't be trusted." I thought about that as I stared out my window at the lights reflecting off Lake Michigan. I thought about the woman I used to be before I started questioning every instinct, every memory, every feeling that didn't align with what my family wanted me to believe. Do you know what gaslighting feels like from the inside? It's like being lost in a maze where every path you think you remember has been moved, where your own footsteps become strange and foreign. But sometimes, if you're very quiet and very still, you can hear the truth whispering beneath all the lies. The weeks leading up to Christmas were a careful dance of avoidance and false normalcy. Michael called less frequently, and when he did, his voice carried a coldness I'd never heard before. Jennifer stopped bringing the kids by altogether. Lisa sent perfunctory text messages asking how I was doing, but never waited for a real answer. I spent those gray December days in a kind of limbo, questioning everything I thought I knew about my family and my place in their lives. The apartment felt different now, not like a home filled with memories, but like a museum of a life I was no longer sure had been real. I'd catch myself standing in front of old photographs, studying faces I'd loved completely, looking for signs of the deception I'd missed. When had Michael learned to lie so convincingly? When had Jennifer's smiles become masks? When had I become so desperate for their approval that I'd stopped trusting my own perceptions? The isolation was crushing. I hadn't realized how much my sense of self had become tied up in being needed by them. Without their demands, their crises, their constant requests for help, I felt unmoored, purposeless. I started taking long walks along the lakefront, bundled up against the December wind, watching the ice form along the shore. The cold air cleared my head in a way the stuffy apartment couldn't. Out there, with the vast expanse of water stretching to the horizon, I could breathe again. It was on one of these walks that I met Eleanor, a woman about my age who was sitting on a bench feeding pigeons despite the bitter cold. "They're hungrier in winter," she explained when I paused to watch. "Everything's hungrier in winter." Something about the way she said it made me sit down beside her, and before I knew it, we were talking. Really talking, in a way I hadn't talked to another person in years. She listened without judgment as I told her about the financial papers, about the way my family had made me doubt my own sanity. "I had a daughter who did something similar," Eleanor said quietly. "Convinced me I was losing my memory so she could get control of my accounts. It took me 2 years to untangle the mess she'd made of my finances." "But she was your daughter," I said, as if that should have protected Eleanor from such betrayal. Eleanor laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Being family doesn't make someone trustworthy, dear. Sometimes it just makes the betrayal hurt worse." She gave me the number of a lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse. "Don't wait," she said firmly. "These things don't get better on their own. They only get worse." That night, I sat with the lawyer's business card in my trembling hands, afraid to make the call that would confirm what I already knew, but more afraid of what would happen if I didn't. I called the next morning. Attorney Sarah Chen was younger than I'd expected, probably around 40. with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of the school principal I'd once been friends with. She came to my apartment that same day, spreading the financial documents I'd gathered across my dining table like pieces of a puzzle. "Mrs. Thompson," she said after reviewing everything, her voice gentle but firm, "you've been the victim of identity theft and financial elder abuse. The loans taken out in your name are extensive. Your son and daughter-in-law have been using your credit and personal information to fund their lifestyle for at least 3 years. 3 years, since shortly after Harold died, when I was most vulnerable, most desperate for connection. What do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "First, we report this to the authorities. Then we start the process of reclaiming your financial identity. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But you have rights, and we're going to make sure they're protected." As she explained the legal process ahead of us, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Validation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't a confused old woman making unreasonable accusations. I was a victim of crimes committed by people I'd loved unconditionally. That realization should have felt empowering. Instead, it felt like another death. The death of the family I'd thought I had. The death of the son I'd believed I'd raised to be honest and kind. Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold, with the promise of snow and the heavy clouds hanging over the city. I'd spent the morning cleaning my apartment. Not for company. I wasn't expecting any, but because the routine gave me something to do with my hands while my mind churned. The lawyer had filed the initial reports, and Michael would be served with papers after the holidays. I hadn't decided yet whether to tell him I knew what he'd done before the authorities contacted him, or whether to let him find out the hard way. Part of me still hoped for reconciliation. Still believed that maybe, if I explained how much he'd hurt me, if I showed him the evidence of what his actions had cost me both financially and emotionally, he might apologize. Make things right. Return to being the son I'd thought he was. That's the thing about hope when you're older. It becomes both more precious and more dangerous. You have less time left to believe in second chances, which makes you hold on to them more desperately even when logic tells you to let go. The call came at 2 p.m. "Mom?" Michael's voice sounded strained, uncertain. "We need to talk." "About what?" I asked, though we both knew. "About Christmas dinner tomorrow. About the family." There was a long pause. I could hear voices in the background, Jennifer talking to someone, children laughing at something on television. "I want you to know," he continued, "that despite our recent disagreements, you're still welcome tomorrow. The kids are asking about their grandmother." Were they really asking? Or was this another manipulation? Using my grandchildren's supposed affection as bait to draw me back into their web? "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm not sure that's a good idea right now." "Mom, please, it's Christmas. Family should be together at Christmas." Family. The word that had defined my entire adult life, that I'd sacrificed everything for, that had been weaponized against me more times than I could count. "Okay," I heard myself saying. "What time?" 2:00. "And Mom? Please don't bring up any of that financial stuff tomorrow, okay? Let's just have a nice family Christmas. Don't bring up the fact that you've been stealing from me for years. Don't mention that you've destroyed my trust and my financial security. Don't ruin Christmas with the inconvenient truth of your betrayal. I'll see you tomorrow," I said, and hung up before I could change my mind. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the elevated train rattle past my building every 15 minutes. What was I walking into? What did they expect from me? Forgiveness? Pretense? Complete submission to their version of reality? I thought about Eleanor's words. Being family doesn't make someone trustworthy. Sometimes it just makes the betrayal hurt worse. But they were still my only family. Without them, who was I? What was the point of all those years of sacrifice if I walked away now? These are the thoughts that keep older women like me trapped, aren't they? The fear that standing up for ourselves means standing alone. The terror that demanding respect means losing love entirely. I got up before dawn Christmas morning, just as I always did. Made my coffee, looked out at the lake where ice was forming in thin sheets along the shore. The world looked clean and new under its blanket of fresh snow, full of possibility and promise. If only I'd known it would be the last peaceful moment I'd have for a long time. I dressed carefully that morning. My good blue dress, the pearl earrings Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary, a touch of lipstick that made me feel more like myself. I wanted to look dignified, composed, worthy of respect. I brought homemade rolls and a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford but felt I should contribute. Old habits die hard, even when you know you're walking into a house where your value is measured only in what you can provide. The South Loop had gotten fancier since Michael and Jennifer had moved there. Their building had a doorman who nodded politely as he let me in, marble floors in the lobby, a Christmas tree decorated with gold and silver ornaments that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Their apartment was warm and filled with the sounds of family, children's laughter, Christmas music playing softly, the smell of turkey and sage dressing. For a moment, standing in their doorway, I felt a surge of the old longing. This was what I'd wanted. This was what I'd worked and sacrificed and bent myself into impossible shapes to preserve. "Grandma!" Emma ran to hug me, and for that instant, everything else fell away. She was almost 11 now, tall and graceful like her mother, but she still hugged with the complete abandon of childhood. "Hi, sweetheart," I whispered into her hair. "I missed you." "I missed you too. I've been practicing piano and I want to play for you after dinner." Tommy was more reserved. At 8, he was already learning the complicated social dynamics of family loyalty. He hugged me dutifully, but kept glancing at his parents as if checking whether his affection was appropriate. Little Sarah was 3 now, and she didn't remember me well. She hid behind Jennifer's legs, peeking out occasionally with curious eyes. "Mom," Michael said, accepting the wine I offered with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Thanks for coming. The kids were really excited." Jennifer's smile was more careful, more controlled, but she made the right noises about how nice I looked, how good it was to see me. For the first hour, it felt almost normal. We talked about safe topics, the children's school activities, the weather, plans for New Year's. I helped in the kitchen, falling back into the familiar role of the helpful grandmother, the extra pair of hands who made everything easier for everyone else. But I could feel the tension underneath the pleasant veneer, the careful way conversations stopped when I entered a room, the meaningful glances exchanged between Michael and Jennifer when they thought I wasn't looking. They were waiting for something, planning something. The explosion came, as explosions do, without warning. We were gathered in the living room after dinner, the children playing with their new toys, the adults nursing glasses of wine and eggnog. I was sitting on the floor with Sarah, helping her dress a new doll, when Emma approached with a wrapped present. "This is for you, Grandma," she said shyly. I picked it out myself. Inside the wrapping paper was a small picture frame containing a drawing Emma had made, stick figures labeled "My Family," with Grandma standing off to one side, noticeably separate from the others. "It's beautiful, honey," I said, meaning it. Children's art has a devastating honesty that adults spend their lives learning to hide. "Read the back," Emma prompted. I turned the frame over. In Emma's careful 3rd-grade handwriting, "To Grandma, who loves us even when she can't be with us anymore." Even when she can't be with us anymore. The words hit me like ice water. I looked up sharply at Michael, who was studying his wine glass with intense concentration. "What does that mean, Emma?" I asked carefully. "Daddy said you're sick and you can't take care of us anymore. He said you might go live somewhere else where there are doctors to help you." The room went completely silent, except for the Christmas music still playing softly in the background. Tommy looked confused. Sarah continued playing with her toys. But Emma was watching me with the acute awareness that children have when they sense adult drama they don't understand. "I'm not sick, sweetheart," I said gently, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. "I don't know why Daddy would say that." "Mom," Michael said quickly, "we don't need to discuss this now." "Oh, I think we absolutely need to discuss this now," I interrupted, standing up from the floor with Emma's drawing still clutched in my hands. "What exactly have you been telling the children about me?" Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We've been preparing them for the possibility that you might need specialized care, given your recent behavior." "My recent behavior?" "The paranoid accusations, the financial delusions, the irrational anger." Michael's voice was taking on that cold, authoritative tone I'd heard before. "We think it might be early-stage dementia." Dementia. They were telling people I had dementia. "And I suppose this convenient diagnosis means you'll need to take over my finances completely," I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "For my own protection, of course." "Mom, please. The kids deserve to know who their grandmother really is," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Not some fictional crazy person you've invented to justify stealing from me." That's when he exploded. "You're ruining everything!" Michael screamed, his face red with a rage I'd never seen before. "We invite you into our home. We try to include you in our family. And you throw these insane accusations around. You're sick, Mom. You need help." The children froze. Sarah started to cry. Emma backed away from both of us, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Stop it," I said quietly. "You're scaring them." "I'm scaring them. You're the one making wild claims about financial fraud. You're the one who can't let go of your paranoid fantasies long enough to enjoy Christmas with your grandchildren." The words kept coming, each one designed to wound, to diminish, to make me doubt everything I knew to be true. According to him, I was delusional, manipulative, bitter, and increasingly dangerous to be around children. Jennifer joined in, her voice sharp with frustration and something that sounded almost like hatred. "We've tried to be patient with you, but enough is enough. You can't keep disrupting our lives with these episodes." Episodes. As if fighting for my own financial survival was a mental health crisis. I looked around the room, at my son's furious face, at Jennifer's cold contempt, at my grandchildren huddled together on the couch looking terrified and confused. This wasn't my family anymore. Maybe it never had been the family I'd thought it was. "I'm going to leave now," I said quietly, gathering my purse and coat. "Good," Michael spat. "Maybe you can use the time to think about getting the help you obviously need." I walked to where Emma was sitting, her drawing still in my hands. I knelt down so we were eye level. "Emma, sweetheart, I want you to remember something. I love you very much, and I'm not sick. Sometimes adults disagree about things, but that doesn't mean anyone is sick or wrong or bad. Do you understand?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. I kissed her forehead, waved goodbye to Tommy and Sarah, and walked out of that apartment with more dignity than I thought I possessed. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like descending into a new life, one where I was no longer defined by their needs, their demands, their version of who I was supposed to be. I walked out into the December evening, the snow crunching under my feet, the city lights reflecting off the white streets like scattered stars. I was alone for the first time in my adult life, but I wasn't broken. I was free. Do you know what it feels like to realize that the people you've loved most in the world see you as nothing more than a resource to be managed? The moment when you understand that all your sacrifices, all your compromises, all your endless giving was never about love at all. It's devastating, but it's also liberating in ways I never could have imagined. I walked the 6 blocks back to my apartment building, my cheeks burning from cold and tears I didn't try to hide. Mrs. Rodriguez was in the lobby checking her mail, and she took one look at my face and knew. "Coffee?" she asked simply. "Please." We sat in her kitchen, which was identical to mine but somehow warmer, filled with the smell of cinnamon and vanilla and decades of meals shared with people who actually valued her. She didn't ask what happened. She just listened while I told her everything. The dinner, the accusations, Michael's explosion, the terrible realization that they'd been planning to have me declared incompetent. "He's been setting it up for months," I said, the understanding coming clear for the first time. The papers I signed, the financial confusion, telling people I was having memory problems. It was all leading to this. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "My neighbor in San Antonio went through the same thing with her youngest son. They had her in a nursing home and control of her assets within 6 months. But I stopped it in time?" "You stopped it just in time, mija. But they won't give up easy. People like that, they don't quit when the money's still on the table." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Emma's drawing, about her innocent acceptance that Grandma couldn't be with them anymore because she was sick. How do you undo that kind of poison? How do you reclaim a relationship with grandchildren who've been taught to see you as dangerous, unstable, unreliable? But underneath the grief was something else, something I'd almost forgotten existed. Anger. Clean, righteous, energizing anger at the injustice of what they'd done. Not just the financial theft, though that was criminal enough, but the systematic destruction of my reputation, my relationships with my grandchildren, my sense of reality itself. They'd tried to erase me from my own life, and I'd almost let them do it. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called attorney Sarah Chen on her personal number. She'd given it to me in case of emergencies. "I want to move forward with everything," I told her. "The financial fraud charges, the identity theft report, all of it. And I want to document their attempts to have me declared incompetent." "Are you sure? Once we start this process, there's no going back to family dinners and pretending everything's fine." "There was never going to be any going back," I said. "They made sure of that yesterday." The legal wheels began turning slowly, but inevitably. Within a week, Michael received notice that he was being investigated for financial elder abuse. Jennifer got letters about the credit cards and loans they'd taken out in my name. The cryptocurrency account was frozen pending investigation. Sarah Chen was thorough and relentless. She'd seen this pattern before. Adult children who viewed their aging parents as ATMs, who justified their theft with concerns about their parents' declining mental capacity. The law, she assured me, had finally begun to catch up with this particular form of family betrayal. Michael's first response was exactly what I'd expected. A phone call full of hurt confusion and accusations that I was destroying the family. How could I involve lawyers in what should be a private family matter? Didn't I understand that everything he'd done was for my own good? "You're sick, Mom," he said, his voice taking on that patient tone people use with children or the mentally impaired. "These lawyers are taking advantage of your confusion. They're the ones stealing from you, not me." But I wasn't confused anymore. I was the clearest I'd been in years. "Michael," I said calmly, "I have copies of every fraudulent document, every forged signature, every unauthorized transaction. My lawyer has reviewed everything with financial experts. This isn't confusion. This is evidence." The silence on the other end of the line stretched out until I thought he might have hung up. "If you go through with this," he said finally, "you'll never see your grandchildren again." There it was, the ultimate threat, the weapon he'd been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. "That choice is yours to make," I replied. "But I won't be blackmailed into silence about crimes committed against me." He hung up without saying goodbye. The next few weeks were a strange mixture of legal procedures and profound loneliness. I met with investigators, signed affidavits, provided documentation of years of financial manipulation. Each meeting revealed new layers of deception, investments I'd supposedly authorized, business partnerships entered into with my forged signature, even a life insurance policy on me with Michael listed as the sole beneficiary. The scope of it was staggering. They hadn't just stolen my money. They'd colonized my entire financial identity, turning me into a resource for their ambitions and lifestyle choices. But the hardest part wasn't the money, it was the isolation. My daughter Lisa called once, her voice tight with what sounded like rehearsed talking points. "Mom, I think you should know that Michael and Jennifer are very concerned about you. This vendetta you're pursuing, it's not healthy. Maybe you should consider talking to someone, a therapist or—" "You mean a psychiatrist?" I interrupted. "Someone who could provide documentation of my supposed mental incapacity." "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant, Lisa. And the fact that you're participating in this campaign to discredit me tells me everything I need to know about where your loyalties lie." I hung up on my own daughter for the first time in my life. The silence that followed was absolute. No calls, no texts, no accidental encounters at the grandchildren's school plays or soccer games. I'd been erased from their lives as efficiently as they'd tried to erase my financial independence. The isolation should have broken me. For most of my life, it would have. I would have crawled back, apologized for standing up for myself, accepted whatever crumbs of affection they were willing to offer in exchange for dropping the charges and returning to my role as the family's personal bank account. But something had shifted in me during that terrible Christmas dinner. Something fundamental about how I saw myself and what I was willing to accept. Maybe it was finally understanding that their love had always been conditional on my usefulness, my compliance, my willingness to bankrupt myself for their benefit. Maybe it was the lawyer's validation that I wasn't crazy or paranoid, that everything I'd suspected was not only true but criminal. Or maybe I'd just reached that point in life where the fear of being alone became less powerful than the need to be authentic. I started filling my days differently. Instead of waiting by the phone for calls that never came, I took long walks along the lakefront. I discovered the Chicago Cultural Center and spent afternoons in their free lectures and concerts. I joined a book club at the local library, where other women my age discussed novels and memoirs and ideas that had nothing to do with what we could provide for other people. The financial investigation moved forward with bureaucratic slowness, but it moved forward. Bank accounts were frozen, credit reports were corrected, and slowly, painfully, my identity was returned to me. But the real transformation was happening inside me. One February evening, as I was reading in my living room with a cup of tea and my cat sleeping on my lap, I'd adopted her from a shelter after decades of Michael insisting that pets were too much trouble. My phone rang. It was Emma. "Grandma?" Her voice was small and uncertain. "I got your letter." I'd sent birthday cards to all 3 grandchildren, not knowing if they'd ever receive them. Apparently, at least one had made it through. "Hi, sweetheart. How are you?" "I'm okay. Daddy said you were sick, but your letter didn't sound sick. It sounded like you." Children have an uncanny ability to cut through adult deceptions and see truth clearly. "I'm not sick, Emma. I'm actually feeling better than I have in a very long time." "Are you still my grandma?" The question broke my heart. "I will always be your grandma, honey. No matter what anyone says or does, that will never change." We talked for 10 minutes before I heard Jennifer's voice in the background, sharp with alarm. The call ended abruptly, but not before Emma whispered, "I love you, Grandma." That night, I cried harder than I had since Harold died. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that at least one relationship in my family might be salvaged, that my grandchildren might not be permanently poisoned against me. It gave me hope, but it also strengthened my resolve. I was fighting not just for my financial security, but for the right to be their grandmother without having to purchase that privilege with my dignity and independence. Spring came early that year, the snow melting into rushing streams that carried winter away down storm drains and into the lake. I felt like I was experiencing my first real spring in decades, not just surviving until the weather improved, but actually celebrating the return of light and warmth and possibility. The legal case was building momentum. Michael's business associates were being questioned about investments made with my forged authorization. Jennifer's law firm was conducting an internal investigation after learning that one of their partners had been involved in identity theft. The financial institution that had enabled so many of the fraudulent transactions was facing regulatory sanctions. But more importantly, I was building a new life. I'd started volunteering at a senior center, teaching basic computer skills to other older adults who'd been intimidated by technology. It felt good to be useful again, but useful by choice rather than manipulation. Mrs. Rodriguez and I had become close friends, spending evenings together watching old movies and sharing stories of the lives we'd lived before we became defined solely by our relationships to other people. She'd been a teacher for 40 years before retiring, and her insights into human behavior helped me understand patterns I'd been blind to for decades. "People will take as much as you're willing to give," she told me one evening as we watched the sunset from her balcony. "The mistake we make is thinking that giving more will make them love us more. But respect and love aren't the same thing. You can't buy one with the other." I was learning to live with less contact with family members, fewer responsibilities for other people's problems, less certainty about what the future would hold. But I was also living with more peace, more self-respect, more authentic connections with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. The breakthrough came in June. Sarah Chen called me on a Tuesday morning with news that the district attorney's office was prepared to file formal charges against Michael and Jennifer for financial elder abuse, identity theft, and fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, and they'd found similar patterns with other elderly family members in Jennifer's extended family. "This was never just about you," Sarah explained. "They've been systematically exploiting older relatives for years. Your case was just the most extensively documented. I should have felt vindicated, triumphant. Instead, I felt mostly tired." "What happens now?" I asked. "They'll likely be offered a plea bargain, restitution, probation, community service. If they refuse and it goes to trial, they could face significant prison time." Prison time! For my son. For the baby I'd rocked to sleep. The child I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I'd been so proud of when he graduated college. "I need to think about this," I said. "Mrs. Thompson, you don't have to think about anything. The state is prosecuting these crimes whether you cooperate or not. Your decision is whether you want to be involved in seeking restitution for your losses." That afternoon, I walked to the lake and sat on my favorite bench, the one where I'd met Eleanor all those months ago. The water was choppy with summer wind, full of sailboats and kayakers enjoying the warm weather. I thought about forgiveness and justice, about the difference between enabling and loving, about what kind of grandmother I wanted to be for Emma and Tommy and Sarah. A family walking past caught my attention. 3 generations enjoying an afternoon together. The grandmother was probably about my age, laughing at something her teenage granddaughter had said, completely comfortable in her role as the family matriarch. Not the family bank account, not the family scapegoat. Just a woman who was clearly loved and respected for exactly who she was. I wanted that. Not just for me, but for my grandchildren. I wanted them to grow up understanding that love doesn't require financial transactions, that family relationships should be built on mutual respect rather than exploitation, that their grandmother deserved to be treated with the same basic decency they'd expect for themselves. The decision crystallized in that moment. I wouldn't drop the charges. I wouldn't accept a return to the old patterns. If my son and daughter-in-law wanted a relationship with me, they were going to have to earn it by demonstrating that they could treat me like a human being worthy of respect rather than a resource to be managed. It meant accepting that I might never have a traditional family relationship with my grandchildren. It meant living with the possibility that I'd spend my remaining years with limited contact with the people I'd loved most in the world. But it also meant living with integrity, with self-respect, with the knowledge that I'd finally learned to value myself enough to demand that others do the same. The confrontation I'd been dreading came in August. Michael called and asked to meet with me. Not at his apartment, not at mine, but at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park where we'd be in public and hopefully civil. He looked older when I saw him, grayer around the edges, the confident arrogance I'd seen at Christmas replaced by something more uncertain. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. "Mom," he said, standing when I approached his table. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." I sat down across from him, noting the expensive coffee and pastry he'd already ordered. Even now, even in these circumstances, he was spending money he'd probably stolen from me. "The lawyers say you're willing to consider a settlement," he began without preamble. "The lawyers say a lot of things. What do you say, Michael?" He looked uncomfortable with the question, as if he'd expected this to be a business negotiation rather than a conversation between a mother and son. "I say this has all gotten out of hand. I never meant for things to get this complicated. Complicated, as if systematic financial fraud was just a minor miscommunication." "What did you mean then? When you forged my signature on loan documents? When you opened credit accounts in my name? When you told people I had dementia?" He flinched at each question but didn't answer directly. "I was trying to help you," he said finally. "You weren't managing your finances well after Dad died. You were vulnerable to scammers, to people who might take advantage of you. I thought if I could consolidate your accounts, make sure everything was being handled properly." "Stop," I interrupted. "Just stop. We both know that's not true. You weren't protecting me from scammers. You were the scammer." The mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw anger flash across his face before he composed himself again. "Fine," he said. "You want the truth? The truth is that you're old and you're going to die soon. And that money was just sitting there earning practically nothing while we're struggling to build a life for our children. We thought you'd understand. We thought you'd want to help." There it was. The real truth underneath all the lies and justifications and gaslighting. I was going to die soon, so my money was really theirs already. My autonomy, my dignity, my right to control my own financial future, none of that mattered because I was just a temporary custodian of resources that rightfully belonged to them. "And if I hadn't found out?" I asked quietly. "If I'd never discovered what you were doing?" He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "You probably wouldn't have. You weren't paying that much attention to the details. Because I'd trusted him completely. Because when your child handles your finances, you assume they're acting in your best interest rather than systematically looting your life savings." "What about the children?" I asked. "What about Emma asking why Grandma can't be with them anymore because she's sick?" This time he did look ashamed. "Jennifer thought it would be easier for them if they understood why you might be difficult, sometimes." Difficult. Because standing up for myself, questioning obvious fraud, demanding basic honesty, that was difficulty rather than self-preservation. We sat in silence for several minutes. I watched families at other tables, normal families where 3 generations could share a meal without criminal investigations hanging over their heads, and felt a deep sadness for what we'd lost. Or maybe what we'd never really had. "What do you want from me, Michael?" I asked finally. "I want you to drop the charges. I want us to work this out as a family. I want my children to have their grandmother back. And what are you willing to give me in return?" The question seemed to surprise him, as if he'd expected his request to be sufficient, his desire for reconciliation to automatically supersede my need for justice. "We'll pay back the money," he said reluctantly. "It'll take time, but we'll work out a payment plan. All of it, including the cryptocurrency investments you made without my knowledge, the business ventures you funded with my forged signatures, the retirement accounts you borrowed against." His face went pale. Clearly, he hadn't realized how thoroughly I'd documented the extent of his theft. "We can work something out," he said weakly. "And what guarantee do I have that you won't do this again? That you won't wait 6 months or a year and then decide that some new crisis justifies helping yourself to my resources?" He didn't have an answer for that, because we both knew there was no guarantee. Trust, once broken so completely, doesn't heal just because someone promises to be better. "I'm your son," he said finally, as if that should be enough. "Yes," I agreed. "You are my son, and that makes what you did so much worse, not better." I stood to leave, but he grabbed my arm. "Please, Mom, don't do this. Don't destroy our family over money." I looked down at his hand on my arm. Not violent, but possessive, controlling, presumptuous, and felt the last of my sympathy for him evaporate. "I'm not destroying our family, Michael. You already did that when you decided I was worth more to you as a victim than as a mother." I pulled my arm free and walked out of that coffee shop knowing I'd never sit across a table from my son again, unless it was in a courtroom. The trial, when it finally came, was both anticlimactic and devastating. Michael and Jennifer both pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for restitution and probation. They avoided prison time, but their reputations were destroyed. Jennifer lost her job at the law firm. Michael's business collapsed when his associates learned about the fraud charges. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I felt empty. The money they returned, about 60% of what they'd stolen, allowed me to stabilize my finances and secure my future. But no amount of restitution could restore the years of trust that had been betrayed, the family relationships that had been poisoned, the grandmother-grandchild bonds that had been weaponized. Emma called me once more after the trial, her voice carefully coached, but still genuinely loving. "Grandma, Mommy says I should tell you we're sorry for the misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. Even in their apologies, they couldn't acknowledge the reality of what they'd done. "There wasn't any misunderstanding, sweetheart," I told her gently. "Sometimes adults make bad choices and there are consequences. That's not your fault, and it doesn't change how much I love you." "When can I see you again?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because I didn't have a good answer. "I don't know, Emma. That's up to your parents. But I want you to know that I think about you every single day, and I hope that someday when you're older, you'll understand why I had to make some difficult choices." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and grieved for the relationships that might have been, for the grandmother I'd wanted to be, for the family legacy I'd hoped to leave behind. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: peace. For the first time since Harold died, I wasn't waiting for someone else to define my worth. I wasn't measuring my value by how much I could give or how much I was needed. I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate what others wanted from me and deliver it before they could become disappointed. I was simply Margaret Thompson, a 73-year-old woman living alone in Chicago, responsible only for her own happiness and well-being. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. That winter, instead of spending Christmas alone in my apartment thinking about the family dinner I wasn't invited to, I did something unprecedented. I booked myself a holiday cruise to the Caribbean. The suite I chose had a balcony overlooking the ocean, with room service and daily housekeeping and absolutely no responsibilities except deciding whether I wanted to attend the evening entertainment or read quietly in my cabin. On Christmas morning, I woke up to sunshine streaming through my cabin window and the sound of waves against the ship's hull. I ordered breakfast to my room, fresh fruit and French toast and coffee that someone else had made, and ate it while watching dolphins play in the ship's wake. It was the most peaceful Christmas I'd had in 20 years. That afternoon, I attended a holiday concert performed by the ship's musicians. The woman sitting next to me was about my age, traveling alone like me, and during intermission we struck up a conversation. "First solo cruise?" she asked. "First solo anything," I admitted. I've spent my entire adult life taking care of other people. This is my first vacation just for me." She smiled knowingly. I started traveling alone after my divorce. Best decision I ever made. When you're not responsible for anyone else's good time, you discover what actually makes you happy. What actually makes me happy? I realized I hadn't thought about that question in decades. Over the next few days, as I explored new ports and tried new foods and met new people, I began to compile a list of things that brought me genuine joy, rather than the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. I liked morning coffee on my balcony while watching the sunrise. I liked conversations with strangers who knew nothing about my family drama and saw me simply as an interesting woman with her own stories to tell. I liked having enough money in my bank account to order whatever I wanted from the room service menu without calculating whether I could afford it. I liked not checking my phone constantly for messages that never came. I liked making decisions based on my own preferences rather than trying to anticipate what others expected from me. I liked the feeling of possibility that came with waking up in a new place each day. Most of all, I liked the version of myself I was becoming: independent, confident, unapologetic about taking up space in the world. When I returned to Chicago in January, I was different. Not just refreshed from vacation, but fundamentally changed in how I saw myself and my place in the world. I started making other changes. I redecorated my apartment, replacing the faded furniture and worn carpets with things I actually liked rather than things I thought others would find acceptable. I joined a senior travel group and started planning more trips. I took a watercolor painting class and discovered I had artistic abilities I'd never explored. But the biggest change was internal. I stopped waiting for my family to contact me, stopped checking my phone hopefully every few hours, stopped measuring my worth by their approval or disapproval. Instead, I built a new life centered around my own interests and values. Mrs. Rodriguez and I became travel companions, taking weekend trips to Milwaukee and Grand Rapids and other Midwestern cities we'd always meant to visit. Eleanor, the woman I'd met at the lakefront, introduced me to her book club, and I found myself part of a community of women who'd also learned to value themselves enough to demand respect from others. I started writing, first in a journal, then in short stories that I shared with my writing group at the community center. Many of my stories were about older women who'd spent their lives giving everything to their families, only to discover that their love had been taken for granted, their sacrifices unappreciated, their identities erased. Writing those stories helped me process my own experience, but it also connected me with other women who'd lived similar struggles, women who'd learned too late that love should never require the complete sacrifice of self-worth. Spring came again, and with it, an unexpected letter. It was from Emma, now 12 and in middle school. Her handwriting had improved, but more importantly, her thinking had matured. "Dear Grandma," it began, "I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I wanted to tell you that I don't think you were wrong. Daddy and Mommy did take your money without asking, and that's stealing. I would be mad too if someone stole from me, even if they said it was to help me. I miss you, and I hope someday we can be friends again when I'm old enough to make my own decisions about who I want to spend time with. Love, Emma." I cried reading that letter, not from sadness but from joy and pride and hope. My granddaughter was growing up to be a person with integrity, someone who could recognize right from wrong even when it was inconvenient, even when it meant acknowledging that the adults in her life had made serious mistakes. I wrote back immediately, telling her how proud I was of her ability to think independently, how much her letter meant to me, and how much I looked forward to the day when we could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than family obligation. I ended the letter with something I wished someone had told me at her age. Never let anyone convince you that love requires you to accept disrespect. The people who truly care about you will treat you with kindness and honesty, and they'll never ask you to sacrifice your own well-being for their comfort. That summer, on my 74th birthday, I threw myself a party. Not a family gathering where I cooked and cleaned and catered to everyone else's needs, but an actual celebration of my life and accomplishments. I invited Mrs. Rodriguez and Eleanor and the women from my book club and the travel group and the painting class. We ate catered food from my favorite Mexican restaurant, drank good wine, and spent the evening sharing stories and laughter. At one point, Mrs. Rodriguez stood up to make a toast. "To Margaret," she said, raising her glass. "Who taught all of us that it's never too late to choose yourself? Who showed us that demanding respect doesn't make you selfish, it makes you strong?" As I looked around the table at these women who'd become my chosen family, I felt a contentment I'd never experienced before. Not the anxious satisfaction of being needed, but the genuine happiness of being valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. Later that evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the lights reflect off Lake Michigan, I thought about the Christmas when my son had screamed at me that I was ruining everything. He'd been right, in a way. I had ruined everything. Every manipulative dynamic, every exploitative relationship, every pattern that required me to diminish myself so others could feel bigger. But what I'd built in place of those toxic patterns was so much better. A life based on authenticity rather than performance. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than financial transactions. Days filled with activities that brought me joy rather than obligations that drained my spirit. I thought about the suite I'd booked that first Christmas after the confrontation. The sea view that had reminded me there were vast horizons beyond the small, suffocating world I'd been living in. That room had been more than just a hotel accommodation. It had been a symbol of my commitment to valuing myself enough to invest in my own happiness. Now, 2 years later, I was living that commitment every day. As I write this, it's been 3 years since that terrible Christmas dinner. 3 years since I discovered the extent of my family's betrayal. 3 years since I learned to say no and mean it. Michael and Jennifer divorced last year. Apparently, financial stress and criminal investigations aren't great for a marriage built on mutual exploitation. He moved back in with his parents in Milwaukee, and she relocated to California with the children. Emma writes me occasionally, her letters showing increasing maturity and independence. Tommy sent me a drawing he made in art class last month. Sarah probably doesn't remember me at all, but maybe that's for the best. Maybe she'll grow up in a family that's learned to address their problems honestly, rather than scapegoating the most vulnerable members. I don't know if I'll ever have a relationship with my grandchildren that resembles what I once hoped for. I don't know if my son will ever acknowledge the depth of the harm he caused or take genuine responsibility for his actions. What I do know is that I've learned to build a meaningful life that doesn't depend on their recognition or approval. I've learned that love without respect is manipulation, that family relationships must be earned, not assumed. That setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary for emotional survival. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to choose yourself. Never too late to say enough. Never too late to walk away from people who treat you badly, even if, especially if, they're people you love. The woman I am now barely resembles the anxious, people-pleasing person I was 3 years ago. I sleep better, laugh more, worry less. I have friendships based on genuine affection rather than mutual need. I have hobbies that feed my soul rather than obligations that drain it. When people ask me about my family situation, I tell them the truth. I made the difficult decision to prioritize my own well-being over maintaining relationships that were harming me. Some people understand immediately. Others look at me with a mixture of pity and judgment, unable to imagine choosing independence over family connection. I don't try to convince anyone. I've learned that people who haven't lived through systematic emotional and financial abuse often can't understand the courage it takes to break free from it, especially when it comes from family members. But I've also learned that my story resonates with more people than I ever expected. Older women, especially, who've spent their lives giving everything to children and grandchildren who took that devotion for granted. Women who've been told they're selfish for wanting basic respect, paranoid for questioning obvious deception, difficult for having boundaries. Women who, like me, Had to learn that loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to abuse you. That being a good mother or grandmother doesn't require accepting unlimited exploitation. That family loyalty is a two-way street, or it should be. If you've listened to my story and recognized yourself in it, if you've felt that familiar ache of loving people who don't seem to value you beyond what you can provide, I want you to know something. You deserve better. You deserve to be treated with the same kindness and respect you show others. You deserve relationships that don't require you to bankrupt yourself financially or emotionally. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not what you can give. And it's never too late to start demanding those things. It won't be easy. People who benefit from your endless giving will resist when you start setting boundaries. They'll try to make you feel guilty, selfish, unreasonable. They might threaten to cut you out of their lives entirely if you don't return to your old patterns of self-sacrifice. Let them. Anyone who would abandon you for refusing to be exploited was never really loving you in the first place. They were loving what you could do for them, which is not the same thing at all. The loneliness you feel when you start prioritizing yourself might be overwhelming at first. I won't lie to you. There were nights when I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake, if being alone was worse than being disrespected. But that loneliness passes, and what replaces it is so much better than what you've lost. Peace, self-respect, authentic connections with people who value you appropriately. Days filled with activities you choose rather than obligations imposed on you by others. The freedom to be yourself without constantly performing for someone else's approval. The confidence that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself. The dignity of living according to your own values rather than someone else's expectations. It's never too late to book your own suite with a sea view. Never too late to choose the vast horizon over the suffocating room you've been assigned. You just have to be willing to walk through the door. Have you ever lived something similar to what I've shared with you today? Have you experienced the pain of realizing that family love came with hidden costs? That your generosity was being exploited by the very people you cared about most? Please share your story in the comments below. Let others know they're not alone in this struggle, that it's possible to reclaim your life and your dignity no matter how old you are or how long you've been trapped in these patterns. If my story has touched something in your heart, if it's given you hope or validation or the courage to consider making changes in your own life, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It helps me reach other people who need to hear these words, other women and men who are struggling to find their way out of relationships that diminish rather than celebrate them. Your story matters. Your pain is valid. Your future can be different. You just have to be brave enough to choose yourself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for allowing me to share the most difficult and transformative period of my life. Thank you for being part of a community that understands that love should never require the sacrifice of self-respect. Until we meet again, remember, you are worthy of love that doesn't cost you everything. You deserve relationships that add to your life rather than subtract from it. You have the right to be happy, peaceful, and autonomous, no matter what anyone else thinks about those choices. The sea view is waiting for you. You just have to have the courage to book the room.